Welcome, my dear brothers and sisters, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We are on part 16 today. We're going to finish up what we started last week, looking at the Catholic Reformation. If you remember, last week we ended by looking at one of the branches of the new monastic orders that were being developed at this time, and it was more than just one. We're looking at examples of these. The one last week was developed by St. Teresa, and it was an order that looked to go back to the earlier, more strict form of monasticism. The branch we're going to look at today are those that wanted to answer the questions of the day, wanted to deal with the challenges that were coming about as a result of both the Reformation within the Catholic Church and also the Protestant Reformation, which questioned a lot of the doctrine of the Catholic Church. So these orders wanted to deal with that issue. And the most prominent one from this time period was begun by St. Ignatius Loyola. So let's look at his life a little bit. Ignatius Loyola began a new monastic order a few years earlier than the one created by St. Teresa. The order started by Ignatius was created to respond to the outward challenges the times posed for the church. And there were definitely a lot of challenges for the church at this time, and he wanted to deal with those directly. Ignatius was the scion of an ancient aristocratic family and had hoped to attain glory through a military career. If you're not familiar with that word scion, that means he was the heir to the family fortune. He was a guy that was going to be the one that all of this prestige and obviously the material wealth of this aristocratic family would pass down to. So that's kind of what he was looking for. And he thought that he would achieve his own glory outside of just what his family would pass down to him through a military career, one of the big options at that time for a person in this condition or in his station. So that's what he set out to do. His dream ended when at the siege of Pamplona in Navarre, he suffered a wound that would cause him to limp the rest of his life. So obviously, military career is gone now. If you're limping around, you're not in the military. And so he started it. He intended to continue on, but that was not to be the case. So he had to find something else to do. While bedridden and in excruciating pain, Ignatius had a vision. In the vision, he saw Mary with the infant Jesus. This vision left him with repugnance for his former life, and especially the things of the flesh. Now, it'd be easy to say, well, look at what he's dealing with. He's in bed. He's under medical care. He's in a lot of pain. He's gone through a life-changing episode, and all of his dreams are out the window. So he's probably under not only a lot of physical pain, but also probably a lot of mental anguish and even emotional anguish. And so it's probably not unusual to think he would have some kind of a breakdown, and maybe that's where this vision came from. That's kind of a cynical view on it, and it may actually be correct. I don't know. What we do know, though, is that it made a profound impact on his life. When he saw this vision, he no longer wanted what he had coming to him. He didn't want the prestige. He didn't want the military career. He didn't even want to be the heir of this great aristocratic family fortune. He was absolutely just disgusted with his former life and was ready to walk away from that, especially the things of the flesh. Loyola next went on pilgrimage to the Hermitage of Montserrat. When he arrived, he participated in a rite in which he devoted himself to the Virgin Mary and confessed all his sins. So he set out to leave his old life behind, and he went where a lot of people that were trying to leave their old life behind ended up, and that was out in this hermitage. And at that place, he made the final decision he was going to move on into a new way of life. Afterward, he withdrew to live as a hermit, but this did not calm his spirit as he remained tormented by his own sin. And as we'll see in a moment, this was a lot like Martin Luther. He didn't have an answer to how would his sins be atoned for. And it led Luther to actually break away from the church. That's not what's going to happen with Ignatius, but he is going to have to go through a difficult time in his life through this. Like Luther, Ignatius was haunted by the sins of his past. He just couldn't see how those could be atoned for. He couldn't see how there was an answer for them. But finally, God's grace broke through and gave him peace. So he did finally get to that peaceful place that Luther did, But unlike Luther, this did not prompt Ignatius to leave the Catholic Church, but instead to devote his life to the service of the church and its mission. So where Luther kind of got pushed to more dedication, more devotion in his role as a minister in the church, as a member of the monastic orders in the church, Luther was pushed that way, but that's not what ended up getting him to the place of grace. His study of Scripture got them there. But for Ignatius, it actually did work. And he decided that the way to get peace was to devote himself more to the service of the church and its mission, to become more dedicated to the Catholic Church rather than breaking away from it. And so Ignatius, again, dealing with some of the same issues that Luther did, chose a much different path. And that's going to influence what he ends up doing with his monastic order. If you're wondering what the name of that monastic order is, it's one that you've probably almost certainly heard of, and that's the Jesuits. Ignatius first sought to become a missionary to the Turks. He went to the Holy Land, but was rejected by Franciscans who were already there. So Ignatius felt called to go to the Holy Land to evangelize there. And for whatever reason, the Franciscans, when he got there, they decided he didn't need to be there. So he didn't get to stay. He had to leave. Next, Ignatius decided that he must learn theology in order to better serve God. He studied at the universities of Barcelona, Alcalá, Salamanca, and Paris. So the next step in his life was that he needed to get the theological foundation laid. And we see this a lot with these leaders. They didn't seem to be very well taught. They were sent out kind of to do the work of the church without a strong foundation of understanding of what they believed and why. And when challenges came, they weren't around to answer those. They weren't able to. And, it's a lot like that today. In a lot of ways, our Christians today are not well versed in an understanding of their faith, and not just what they believe, although that's part of it too, but why they believe what they believe and why it's known to be true. We as Christians should have a firm defense of our faith laid up, if nothing else, for our own conscience sake. You're asked as a Christian to give up the life that this world tells you should live. And in some ways that's easy, but in a lot of ways it's not easy. And if what we believe as Christians is not true, then we should turn away from it. We should reject it and walk away. But the fact is that as you look at the evidence, as you look at the proofs of our faith, that Christianity is true. And there's some very strong evidence that it's true. We can be very sure of our faith. But if you don't know that, if you don't understand that, then you have nothing left than mama or daddy told me or the preacher said, and I had a fuzzy feeling one day. Well, you can get a fuzzy feeling in a lot of ways. And I'm not saying there's not an emotional element to Christianity. There certainly is. It's a relationship, and it's a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so it's a dynamic thing. It's not just facts that you learn, but there are facts that you must learn. And if you don't have those down, then you're going to be, in a lot of ways, you're going to be hindered in your walk. And especially if you think about a guy who's a minister, if they don't have their act together, and maybe that's why the Franciscans sent him away. I don't know. But for whatever reason, Ignatius realized, I don't know what I'm doing out here. I need to get my foundation laid. And he did that. And again, that should be an encouragement for all of us. We need to make sure that we understand the tenets of our faith and we are orthodox in our beliefs, and that we understand not just what we believe, but why, and why we can be sure that it's true. And so I encourage you, that's the study of apologetics. I'll encourage you to be a part of that. If you've never studied that before, you should. And you should definitely look at the proof of faith, the evidence, and how we can answer those who challenge us. Because, folks, it's not just coming from outside the church anymore. And that's what's so alarming. I'm ready for the one that comes at me from the secular world. What I'm maybe not ready for is the person who calls himself a fellow Christian who is going to challenge the Orthodox faith that we hold. And there is more and more of that happening all the time. All right, enough about that. Soon a small band gathered around him. In 1534, he returned to Montserrat with this group. There they made solemn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the Pope. So he's now ready to move forward in what he feels like he's been called to do. The initial purpose of this new order was to work among the Turks in the Holy Land. That was something that Ignatius still wanted to do. but he's going to find out that there's a group that he needs to deal with a little bit closer to home. But by the time Pope Paul III gave it his formal approval in 1540, the threat of Protestantism was such that the Jesuits came to be one of the main instruments of the Catholic offensive against them. So the group, instead of going out and trying to deal with the Turks in the Holy Land, the Pope said, the group you need to be worried about is not them. It's the ones the threat closer to home. Protestantism is eroding the church. It's pulling people out. And from their perspective, it was a heretical teaching. And so the Jesuits decided, okay, if that's the threat that's closest to home and that's what the Pope wants, then that's what we're going to do. So they became a powerful weapon in the war as Catholics in the war against Protestantism and in the hands of the Pope. And he did use them for that purpose. The Jesuits also sent missionaries to the Far East and the New World, so they didn't just deal with things at home, they sent missionaries around the world as well. Their organization, patterned after the military, enabled them to respond rapidly and efficiently to various challenges and opportunities. Well, it's absolutely no surprise that they would pattern after the military, because what was it that Ignatius wanted to do? He wanted to be in the military. He was in the military. He had already used that model, so he knew it very well, and he was able to apply it to his group, the Jesuits, and that made them very effective in being able to be used to answer some of the issues that they were facing in their day. Many of them were also scholars who contributed their knowledge to the polemic against Protestantism. So again, they educated themselves. They made sure that they had a ready defense for their own beliefs, and they went out against what they considered to be the big threat, and that was Protestantism. And were able to do that effectively. So that's the Jesuits. That's the group that came along. Again, they were not the only group that had this same kind of mentality that kind of, wanted to answer the issues of the day, but they're definitely the biggest one. In fact, I would be very surprised if anybody listening to this had never heard of them. So they're active today, and they were started by St. Ignatius. Let's look now to papal reformation. So there wasn't just a reformation in the church, but the Pope had some reformation that needed to be done as well. When Luther nailed his theses to the Wittenberg door, the papacy was in the hands of Leo X, who was more interested in embellishing the city of Rome and in furthering the House of Medici than in religious matters. We've talked about Leo X plenty. He was not a reforming pope. He was a corrupt pope. And when Luther was dealing with this stuff, a big part of him dealing with it the way that he did in the breakoff had to do with the corruption within the papacy. Pope Adrian VI offered some hope of reformation, but his unexpected death put to an end what he might have done. So the next guy to come along, Adrian, he said he wanted to be a reformer, and it looked like that and was something he was going to do, but then he died. So that went away. Clement VII, a cousin to Leo X, followed the same course as his kinsman. So no help there. He's going to go along with what Leo wanted to do. They're more interested in building pretty buildings and all of that stuff than they were in trying to reform the church. And it was during his time that England declared itself independent of papal authority, and Charles V sacked Rome. So not a great reign for old Clement there. He had some bad stuff happen. He lost England, and then he got Rome sacked too. So he was a corrupt pope, and bad things happened during his time. Next came Paul III, who seemed to trust astrology more than theology. So that's not all that great. And not only that, but his rule was also tainted by nepotism. So he's bringing his family members in to take these roles. He's a corrupt guy too, but he's not 100% corrupt. He was also a reforming pope. Interestingly enough, he was interested in reform. Now, he wasn't interested in 100% reform, as you could see from what I just said, but he did have at least his mind open and the door open to be involved in reform. He gave official recognition to the Jesuits. That was a big step. In 1536, he appointed a commission of cardinals and bishops to report to him on the need and proposed means of reformation. Paul III, in spite of his own problems, and most all these guys had them, even the ones who seemed like they wanted to make changes, still weren't 100% good themselves. But he did open a door that's going to lead to some reform. Upon receiving the report and realizing that a significant portion of his income derived from practices the commission declared corrupt, declared that it would be best to leave matters as they were. Yeah, so this ain't that great a guy either. We got more, we've talked about these sorry guys that are in leadership, and you hit them in the pocketbook, and all of a sudden, all their fancy desire for reform goes out the window. We got them all over the place right now in our country. You just go ahead and look to Congress, and anything that they get passionate about has two things it's involved in, maybe both. One is their efforts to get reelected. They'll get up in arms about that. And the second one is hitting them where they get their kickbacks. And if you try to take either one of those away from them, you may not get them to jump up about anything else, but you'll get them to jump up about that. So we're full of corruption in this country right now. I don't know if you realize that or not, but it's bad. But they were this way too. So here's the old Pope here. He's all gung ho about reform until it's all this Reformation that they're talking about is going to take money out of my pocket. And at that point, God led him to just say, you know what, we need to leave things as they are. So just another in a long line of sorry leadership, unfortunately. And the church is full of them. It was full of them at that time, and sadly, in a lot of churches this day, they're full of them now. And you can tell them from a mile away by their fruit. If it has to do with money and that gets them to leave their convictions behind, then you've got poor leadership, and you got just a corrupt person. And we had another one here. And yet, in spite of saying that, he still did some things that helped out with reform, believe it or not. He did, however, convene a new council to examine Reformation. It began at sessions in Trent in 1545. So it's kind of the deal where the first one didn't quite work out so much because they tended to, probably rightly so, focus on things that hit him in the pocketbook, but he didn't give up on it. He decided to put it together a new council in hopes that maybe they would focus on some things that wouldn't hit him in the pocketbook. So they started again. So is he a great leader? Is he a shining example of Reformation? No, but he's doing more than most of the other ones did. So I guess in some way you have to give him a little bit of credit. The next pope, Julius III, possessed all the vices of his predecessor while displaying few of his virtues. So that's just a nice way to say he was even bigger scumbag than the guy that came before him. He had all the bad traits and none of the good traits. So it is not going to go well under him. Nepotism under him ran rampant. He's got all his family members involved. Marcellus II, devoted to Reformation, followed, but his sudden death put an end to his pontificate. We got Julius III comes in after we got Paul out. He's just bad, no good at all. And then Marcellus comes in, and Marcellus has a chance to do something good, but just like it seems like it happens a lot, the ones that start out with promise end up dying. And I don't know if that's accidental or not, but maybe it was. Who knows? Anyway, it didn't matter. He didn't do anything to help because he was dead. Finally, in 1555, Cardinal Gian Pietro Carafa was elected Pope. He took the name of Paul IV. He took out immediately to correct the evils that the Commission had decried. Under his leadership, the activities of the Inquisition increased to the point of terror. So you got a little interesting stuff going on here. This Pope wanted to do reform, and he was serious about it, but in his zeal, he sends the Inquisition around, and the Inquisition starts terrorizing people. So you kind of got one extreme or the other, just totally corrupt or maybe a little bit too gung-ho. Although as we saw earlier with some of them, if it starts hitting them where the pocketbook sits, then they all of a sudden became a lot more reasonable about things, I guess you could say. But he deserves credit for having cleansed the Roman Curia and for having placed the papacy at the head of the Catholic Reformation. So this Pope did some good things. He was pretty strict. He was pretty tough, but he did have some Reformation type movement that helped. So we briefly mentioned the Council of Trent, but this is a pretty important part of this. So let's look in a little bit more in depth into the Council of Trent. During the early years of the Reformation, Luther and other leaders appealed to the church for a universal council. The popes opposed such an assembly. They didn't think they had to do it. And if they had done it, things might have turned out differently. But remember, the church at this time historically had one or two ways of dealing with people that challenged their doctrine and that they deemed to be a problem. One way was that they would force them to recant. And the second way was if that didn't work, then they killed them. So they didn't really have to have any special councils to deal with them because they just got rid of them. Now there's some examples of them having councils, but a lot of the times the reason for them was to trick the person into coming out of hiding or wherever where they were protected out in the open, and then they got rid of them. But that wasn't going to work here. And so they didn't have any reason. They didn't want to do it. If they had, who knows? Maybe there could have been common ground. Maybe there could have been an answer to this that wouldn't have resulted in a split. But it didn't happen that way, of course. And the popes weren't going to go about doing it. But during the reign of Paul III, after the breach between Catholics and Protestants became permanent, serious consideration was given to calling a universal council. So now that irrevocable damage has occurred, now the popes are saying, well, maybe we ought to have this council. And so they decided to start looking into it. It was eventually decided that the council would meet at Trent in December of 1545. It was attended by few prelates, 31 in the first session and 213 in the last. So even though there was a small group of these that came, it was still going to turn out to be a very important council. The council was unique in that it was not content in condemning Protestantism, but instead discussed every item of theology that the Protestant Reformation had questioned. Now, understand this, they looked at every one of these items of theology not with any intention to change anything. They were never going to do that. But they looked at it with trying to provide an answer to what the Protestants were protesting against. And the answer was never going to be, hey, you know what, Protestants, you've got a point. The answer was going to be, no, this is not correct what you're saying, and here's why. So they didn't just unilaterally condemn Protestantism. They actually went through all of the biggest arguments that the Protestants had made against the Catholic Church. They took them individually, and their job was to defend them. Not in any way to ever look at saying there's any validity to this, but to be able to actually refute what the Protestants said. And that's exactly what they did. The council also issued a number of decrees for the reformation of the church and took measures regulating the life and worship of the church. So there was some reform of the church as well. But again, just like with all of these reform movements, it has to do with the practices in the church, and it has to do with corruption that had gotten into the leadership. It never had to do with doctrine. They would not touch that. And it would be a long time until they did. Relations between Pope Paul III and Emperor Charles V grew tense. And as a result of that, the council was suspended in 1547. They did reconvene in 1551, but then it immediately suspended again in 1552. So you're going to look, when we get to the end of this, it's an 8-year stretch that this council happened, but it wasn't 8 consecutive years. There was a lot of this time that they were shut down. So it started in 1545, but in December of 1545, so practically 1546, and then just turned right around and got suspended in 1547. So don't know what month that was, but a year plus a little bit, they made it. So there wasn't a lot. Then they didn't reconvene until 1551. So that's 4 years right there before they got started again. You can just throw those out. And even when it did get started again, it was a year or less that it was going. So not a whole lot of time there that is going on without being interrupted. Paul IV became Pope in 1555. He did not reconvene the council during his reign. So when Paul IV came in, he didn't even put the council back together. So that's more years. When Pius IV became Pope in 1562, he brought the council back together. The council finally completed its work in 1563. So it started in 1545 and didn't finish until 1563. So I said 8 years. That's actually wrong. I was looking at the dates wrong. That is a lot of years, a lot more than that. What is that? 18 years, right? So 18 years that this thing went on, and you look at it and you think, my word, that's a long council. Well, it really wasn't. They didn't meet all of that time. They met in about a year plus, let's be generous and say a year and a half before they got suspended. And then they came back for a year or less. So 2-3 years right there that they were together. Then they didn't come back together after they went out in 1552. They didn't come back together until 1562. That's 10 years. and then they finished in 1563. So altogether, you're probably looking at 3 or 4 years this council met, and it may not even have been that much. I'm not. Some of this is partial years. I'm not sure exactly, but over 18 years, they got 3 or 4 years in if they were lucky. So it didn't. The council wasn't continuously going through that time. It was being interrupted, and you can imagine whenever you have a group of people together and you interrupt what you're doing, then it's going to be a mess getting back up, because you got to get everybody back together. You got to get all back on the same page. Everybody's left and come back with different ideas than they had in the first place. So just a very difficult situation for them, a very difficult way of trying to deal with having a council. But they did finish their work finally in 1563. And it was important work that they did. It's important for what was to happen with the Catholic Church. So it's important that we look at the decrees that came out of the Council of Trent. Now, we're not going to be able to look at all of them. There's a bunch, but we'll hit the highlights, the high points. The Council of Trent took several measures of reformation. So they did do acts of reformation. It ordered bishops to reside in their sees. So they said, guys, it might be a good idea if you actually lived where you were supposed to be in charge. And so they had to go and live there. They also condemned pluralism, and that is the holding of several ecclesiastical offices simultaneously. These same corrupt practices just keep coming up. This wasn't the first time that pluralism had been dealt with. It was supposed to have been eliminated, but it didn't get eliminated. It just kept coming back. When leadership was corrupt, the corrupt practices came back. So here we go again. Finally, another council comes about and they say, you got to stop this. Let's get serious about our leadership. Let's get serious about doing things the right way. It also listed and defined the obligations of the clergy, regulated the use of such things as relics and indulgences, and ordered the founding of seminaries for the training of the ministry. You can see that these are some direct things that they're dealing with as a result of the Protestant Reformation, dealing with the way the clergy went about doing their job. But the second one, probably more than the other two, the use of such things as relics and indulgences. That was one of the big things that the Protestant Reformation singled out as being a huge issue, and they were kind of going along unchecked. Now, this Reformation movement, again, they're not going to ever agree with the Protestants. They're not going to say, you guys, you know what, you're right. Let's get rid of the relics. Let's get rid of the indulgences. They weren't going to do that, but they did see that, even though they didn't concede the point, they did see that there was a problem with these things being just used without any kind of check on it. And so they established some rules to, at least, if you're not going to get rid of it, which is what should happen, then at least put some rules in place to try to make it not so crazy. And then, again, this is a reaction to Protestantism as well. Protestantism is very intellectual. It's going to go along intellectual lines with its arguments. And they realized that their leadership they were not educated enough to answer those things. So they found some seminaries, and they are going to be more dedicated to the training of their workers in the ministry. In addition, it promoted the study of Thomas Aquinas, making his the dominant theology in the Catholic Church. So Thomas Aquinas is going to be the guy that becomes the main person that's looked to for theology in the Catholic Church. And this is a big issue, or it's a big deal that that's the way that it went. This has affected the doctrines of the Catholic Church to this day. Well, they certainly did not just end with Reformation things for themselves. They also had a lot to say against Protestantism. The council also took several measures against Protestantism. It declared that the Latin translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, would be authoritative in matters of dogma. So they wanted to get back away from this idea of let's translate the Bible into different languages, and they wanted to get back to having more control. What did it do to have it in Latin? Well, it kept the educated people in the know when it came to reading the Bible, and a lot of the lay people couldn't read it. And so what they're basically have said to them is, yes, there's a translation of the Bible in your language, but when it comes to matters of theology, matters of dogma in the church, you can't use those versions. It's got to be in the Latin. So it doesn't matter that you have a version translated in your language. We're not even going to recognize that. It has to be Latin. So it's more, again, let's get control back into our hands and get it away from these people because they're causing us headaches. It also declared that tradition has an authority parallel to Scripture. That's a big deal as well. What is it that the Protestants are arguing? They're arguing that here's what the scripture says. Here's what the scripture says. This is the way we're to practice. It's not what the church is doing. Well, they've come back and said, you know what? That's great that the scripture said that, but the things that over the years have evolved as far as the way the church does things, that's just as legitimate as what the scripture says. It's on the same level. And so when you've got that, then you don't have to necessarily answer a question about why are you doing things that way when the scripture says that maybe you should be doing them differently. Well, the answer to that is, well, this is church tradition and it's just as valid. And so that was a big thing that they wanted to be able to say to the Protestants is, you don't have an argument. We have the tradition. You don't have that. You split off from us, and we're going to go about things the way that we want to do them. And we don't have to necessarily say that the scripture is the final word on this. The practices of the church through the years are just as valid as that. Then they also affirmed that there were 7 sacraments. Remember, in the Protestant church, there's just 2, baptism and the Lord's Supper, communion. The ones that the Protestant churches, the Protestant tradition didn't recognize, the Catholic Church said, yes, they're valid. And then that the Mass is a true sacrifice that can be offered for the benefit of the deceased. So doing something to help those who die that are in purgatory, help them to get into heaven, you can do that through the Mass. So they affirm that idea, which again, the Protestant church had argued against that. Finally, it stated that communion in both kinds, that is, with the laity receiving both the bread and the wine, was not necessary, and that justification is based on good works done through the collaboration between grace and the believer. This is a big issue for Protestantism. The Protestants said that communion should be offered to the laity exactly the way that it is to all the ministers, that they should be able to receive both the bread and the wine. And the Catholic Church comes back and says, no, they don't have to. And not only that, but here's the real big one. Justification in God's eyes is based not just from completely from the grace of God, but also through the works that the believer does. So it's a joint thing. You have to have the works as well if you want to receive the justification. So this again is an answer to the very thing that Luther had said, that salvation is through grace alone. It is God's grace. Now, obviously, Protestants didn't say that you shouldn't have had any good works, but they would say that justification is not based on your works. It's based on the gift of God. It's a free gift that he just chooses to give. And the Catholic Church goes back and says, no, you can't have it that way. It has to be both things. So again, this is a direct shot back at Protestantism. Many other decrees were made by the Council of Trent as well. So we don't get into all of them, but that's a good snapshot of the major ones. The Council of Trent marked the birth of the modern Catholic Church. So this is going to set the stage for the church as it functions today and the way it goes about doing things. Now, by saying that, don't misunderstand that there haven't been some changes since then. There obviously have been. But this kind of set the tone for what we have even in modern Catholicism. They made some big changes. They course corrected on some things, not everything, but they definitely did make some big decisions. And they are now on a course that's going to take them into modern times. During the next 4 centuries, the Roman Catholic Church refused to concede that many of the elements of the Protestant Reformation that the Council of Trent had rejected did have deep roots in Christian tradition. The people in that council, they knew that some of the things that the Protestants were saying was correct. And you can tell by some of the reform that they did. They never came out and said it, and they never went all the way with it, but they definitely dealt with some issues that Protestants had brought up. But they were so reactionary and defensive against the Protestant Reformation that they felt like they couldn't give any ground there. And so they didn't concede those points, and they were not actually able to honestly have a look at every element of the church and some reform that definitely needed to happen even in the doctrine of the church. So they weren't able to do that then, and it hindered them. They had some reform. It was good, but it wasn't as good as it could have been. It would not be until the 20th century that the Catholic Church would finally be able to set its own agenda for Reformation apart from a reaction to Protestantism. So they felt like Protestantism was such a threat that it was not until the 20th century that they could finally just put that out of the way, forget about the Protestant Reformation. If we say some things that agrees with it, then that's fine. We don't even have to acknowledge that. We're going to deal with us. And it took a long time to get there, and it hindered the church in a lot of ways. Yes, they made some strides to do things better. There was some reform that took place, and you have to give credit for that because there was resistance even to that. But we also have to recognize that it was not as effective as it could have been. And the biggest reason why is they felt that the Protestant Reformation was such a threat to the church that they could not give any ground up. Now, whether that's true or not, history won't tell us because it never happened. You can make a case that it is, you can make a case that it wouldn't have been. But regardless of that, that's the decision they made. So that's going to wrap up looking at the Catholic Reformation during that time. And that's all the time we'll have for today as well. I appreciate you coming back again this week to take time to listen to this. I hope that you enjoyed looking at this. Next week, we'll just continue right on with looking at this time in history. And we'll have a whole lot more going up the next few weeks. Each and every week, I'll be with you and free of charge. And I'll be glad to talk history with you anytime. And so thank you for taking time here again. And I hope that you will be blessed throughout your day and the rest of the week. And hope to have you listen to this again next week. God bless.